Hi, this is Neil with Rock Our World, coming to you from chilly Saskatchewan, Canada. We've had 3 days in a row now of around minus 50 wind chills, and we're working hard to keep our houses warm. What I want to do is tackle a project that dovetails with what I was talking about in my last episode, the straightening out of the God spell. I explained how the English word gospel is literally means a spell from a little god who is Satan the devil, and it's very aptly named. God has a sense of humor because a great deal of what we teach, or what Christians teach, is in gross error. And I always bring in the Jewish people too. Their message is in gross error too, and it's more pointed at the leadership, not the people themselves. But in our modern age, most people have access to all the information they need to learn themselves with the help of the Holy Spirit. And that's a miraculous endeavor. That's something that we can't do on our own. The natural man is against God, cannot understand the things of God. That's why we need the help, the supernatural help of the Holy Spirit to understand these things and be 100% confident of them. So I'm going to say one of the focuses of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about Dan, the tribe of Dan, but I'm going to tie it in with the Christian church in general. I had made a comment, or I noticed it when I was reading my commentaries, say 10 episodes back or so. I made this comment that I don't know why the tribe of Dan is missing in the makeup of the bride of Christ. And a lot of hurdles we have to go through to understand who the bride is. The bride of 144,000. Most Christians have been taught that all these tribes are Jewish, and that's simply a point of willing ignorance. I'll put it that way. I don't want to be offensive, but the Jewish people know who they are. All we have to do is read our scriptures to know who the Jewish people are. They are the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. And then there's 10 leftover tribes that got sent to Assyria, and then they got lost. But they're not lost to God. This is the thing we got to get our minds wrapped around. What we've been taught is wrong. We have a system in place in the Christian church and the Jewish church. And I'm going to focus on Christians here. That is, I got this idea. If you took a can of white paint, and we'll compare that to truth, and you took a can of black paint, and we'll call that evil or misinformation, and you throw the two cans in a pot, you get gray. You get a whole pot full of gray. And that's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is. It's a big pot of gray. You lose the truth in the whole thing because you can't sort out the truth from the error. You just got this big pot of gray. Now God wants, he's the author of the tree of life. And it's pure white. It's pure truth, and that's what he wants. Satan is the author of the dark, and it's called the knowledge of good and evil. So it's the knowledge of evil is the dark part. Satan's the author of it. He's 100% black and evil. And when you mix half and half, and that's what we got in the Christian church, we got half truth, half error. We mix it together, and we really have nothing, because you can't sort the good out from the evil. You can't figure out what's the truth mixed in with all the evil. So that's why God doesn't want half truth, half error. He doesn't even want 3/4 truth and quarter error, or 99% truth and 1% error. He wants pure truth. So that's my analogy for the day. The pot of gray. See, God is not a gray God. He doesn't work in the gray zone. He works with pure truth. And we gotta do the same. We gotta figure out all these lies that Satan has given to the Christian church and the Jewish church, but I'll focus on Christians here. Okay, back to Dan. I'd met that comment, and in the past month we were taking a little bit of a break, and I took the time to read the book of Joshua, amongst other things, mainly the prophets, but I hadn't read Joshua for some time, and had a little more time on my hand. And if you're like me, you read through things, and there's so many details. You think, I could research that detail a little bit, but I'll just keep reading, and then you maybe never get around to it. So when I was reading Joshua, I ran into the two words, or two places actually. They're two, what do you call it? They're names. One is Bethel, and the other is Gilgal. And if you've done a lot of studying in your life, you will find that those two names are dealt with a lot of times. Right throughout the Torah, prophets, and writings, you run into them a lot of times. And they're symbolic of something, symbolic of many things. And to be able to understand when God says, remember what happened at Gilgal, you have to know. He doesn't explain it right there. And then when he says, remember what happened at Bethel, same thing. You have to know the history. So anyway, I had a little extra time, so I went back, and some things I noticed that I'd never noticed before. And if perhaps you'll recall, Bethel was the place where Jacob wrestled with God. And you'll probably remember that when Jacob was born, he grabbed hold of his brother's heel, who was born ahead of him. But part of him came out of the womb first, and they tied a ribbon around his wrist. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff involved in this. And his name meant supplanter, or heel grabber, or someone who unrighteously takes something unrighteously in a tricky manner. Anyway, his name was changed to Israel, which means the Prince of God, I think. But he overcame this character defect. And you'll remember that he tricked his brother Esau into giving up his birthright. Now, God intended to give Jacob the birthright, but he would have done it in a righteous way instead of Jacob having to trick his brother. Anyway, these things are not accidents. God orchestrates all these things, and he's teaching us things. The point here is that back to Jacob wrestling with the Lord at Bethel, that was a place where there was a portal up to heaven, we'll call it. The angels came and up and down, and where he wrestled with the Lord, and and then recalling this character, this part of his character where he grabbed things that ahead of time. We'll put it that way. Anyway, the point I'm going to make is he was the beginning of the Christian church. Now, bear with me while I try and explain all this, but often in the prophets, when they're referring to the house of Israel, there's two groups God works with during the Great Tribulation. The prophets are almost entirely focused on what is going to happen during the Great Tribulation. And because God works with only two groups of people, the house of Israel and the house of Judah, who are the Jewish people, either Christians are left out of the picture or they are the house of Israel. So anyway, back to Jacob. When God's talking about the house of Israel, he'll sometimes call it the house of Jacob. So there's an obvious connection with Jacob, and then he'll more often refer to it as the house of Ephraim or just Ephraim, and then the majority of the time he calls it the house of Israel. They're all the same thing, but the root came from this man Jacob before his name was called to Israel. So that is the background on Bethel. That's a place where Jacob wrestled with God when he was still a supplanter, when he was still I guess you could almost call it a thief. So now, let's speed this thing up. Bethel eventually became one of the cities that the house of Israel gave over to Baal worship. We'll call it Baal worship. It was where, now referring back to 1 Kings 12, where this very, very disobedient group of people called the house of Israel rebelled against God and against the single kingdom, which was all of Israel. And they progressed in their rebellion and they set up 2 golden calves. So that's why I referred to Baal worship. And one was set up in Bethel. So we got a place where there's in one instance has a portal to heaven where the angels come and go. And then this evil house of Israel turned around and used it for Baal worship. So that was one of the towns they put up golden calf, but the other one was the town of Dan. Now, this is something that I didn't know until I did this research. And it's when you read through the book of Joshua, you find that Dan was the only tribe when they were given their inheritance that they didn't take it. Forget how it worded it in my JPS, but they failed to conquer the territory that they were given. They had everything they needed to do it. God made sure that everybody was able to, that each tribe was able to take over their territory. But Dan failed to do the job. And not only did they fail to do the job, then they turned around and went to a city that wasn't their inheritance, and I forget its name, and they conquered it, and then that was their whole territory, was this one city. They didn't take any of their territory they were given, but they took over this city. And then they changed its name to Dan. So all of the territory of Dan became this one city. And then, on top of all these other sins in their as a tribe, they were the other town that was dedicated to the second golden calf of this group of rebellious people called the house of Israel. And if you'll read in 1 Kings 12, you'll see that King Jeroboam was this evil king that was the leader of the rebellion, that he did 4 things. And I encourage you to study those 4 things, and you'll find that they're exactly what the Christian church does today. I'm going to use some metaphors here, but their 2 golden calves are money and religious idols. And you can use your imagination to expand on that. And then the feasts they created that were not God's feasts are Christmas, Easter, Halloween, Advent. What's the other one called? Anyway, if you took all the Christian denominations, you'd have an endless list of festivals that they observe that are not God's. God has 9 appointed times, and the Christians do not keep any of them. Even the day they call the Sabbath, Sunday, that is not the Sabbath day. Anyway, I've covered all these things in other episodes, so go look it up. And then they, instead of using the Levites, which God commanded us all to use them as the teachers, they're gifted as teachers, they took of the lowest and the common people and made them the teachers. And that's, again, what we do. We just say anybody can be a preacher, anybody can be a pastor, just go to a Bible school and get some credentials and you're good to go. And then there's, I'm missing a 4th thing. Anyway, you do your research. There's 4 things there that are exactly what the Christian church does to this day. Anyway, I've made this point before. That was the birth of the Christian church, but I'm going to back it up a little bit, that in fact Jacob was the birth of that character flaw until God corrected it and changed his name to Israel, the Prince of God. Anyway, back to Dan. So when you digest all this information, you see Dan, of all the disobedient 10 tribes, Dan was the most disobedient. Now, whether that's the reason he's missing out of the 144,000, I'm going to propose and speculate that that's at least one of the reasons. Another thing you can look at is the prophetic words that were given to each tribe. That happened more than once, and Dan did come up a little bit short in his prophecy and his prophecies. I didn't take time to research them for this project, but some of the other ones too got some tough raps in their prophetic words. But at any rate, what we're talking about here as a whole is, where did this disobedient spirit come from, for this, in particular, for this group of people called the house of Israel? And then Jesus came along, Yeshua, and he told us he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, let's think about the concept of sheep. Sheep are, let's say they're good, but they're easily led, they're easily swayed, they're easily taken off course, they get lost easily. And it's the shepherds that bear the greatest responsibility in what happens to the sheep. If they have good shepherds, then the sheep are good. And if they have bad shepherds, the sheep go astray. And these are the metaphors that the Lord has used in teaching us all these things. But the bottom line is that the Jewish people are the 2 tribes, and then the Levites are mixed amongst them. So we'll call them 2.5 tribes. And then the lost 10 tribes, so to speak, they got scattered to the world, but Yeshua went out and found them all and gathered them, and there's certain nations that have a stronger gathering of them than others, like Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and I'm sure there's others, but there are lost sheep amongst all the nations, but there's a stronger component in some of these nations. At any rate, Yeshua, Jesus, has been in the process these 2,000 years of gathering his lost sheep. And we are still very, very disobedient. Anyway, I've been talking about how we got to straighten out our God spell, get our good news and our hope, get our teaching to match the teaching of Jesus Christ, and okay, got another one here. I talked about Gilgal. How are we doing here? Now, Gilgal, this is something that I didn't notice in the past. I just would read where God would say, remember what happened at Gilgal? And I think, I want to keep reading and not research that. Well, Gilgal, when the Israelites crossed the Jordan on the Jubilee year, the Lord gave them very specific instructions. He stopped the flow of the river, and they went across on dry land, and they were to gather 12 stones. A member of each tribe would take a stone, and they made a pile of uncut stones, like just the way they were, right in the middle of the Jordan River, at the bottom of the dry riverbed. And they're still there to this day, but they're covered with water. Anyway, that was what God told them to do. Now, if you follow along the story of Joshua, what happened to there were 3 tribes that got a partial inheritance, or an inheritance on the east side of the Jordan before they crossed over into the promised land. And they wanted an inheritance over there. They said, this is good land. So the Lord went ahead and said, okay, you can, but you got to send your fighting men to help and until the land is conquered and everybody has their inheritance. So that happened, and then they could go back. So on their way back, they built a pile of stones, an altar, on the edge of the river after they'd crossed over. Now, they weren't supposed to do that. God has very specific instructions of altar building and so on. And anyway, as the story unfolds, the other tribes found out they did this, and they were all ready to go and correct them, like big time, like kill the offenders, these 3 tribes. And then somebody came up with the bright idea, well, maybe we should ask them first why they did it before we kill them all. So they asked them, and they said, well, it's not an altar. It's just a marker to remind us and our children, generations from now, how this all went. And anyway, the story they made up sounded okay. But what happened is we found out later in the story that they actually did use it to sacrifice that. And that's the point of disobedience. These 10 tribes have this terrible habit of being disobedient. And so when God says things like, remember what happened at Gilgal, remember what happened at Bethel, there's good things happened there. Bethel was the point where they crossed the Jordan, and they did what God said that they were supposed to do. And then later on, they did some things that God said, don't do that. So anyway, they're both places of obedience and disobedience. And they help point out So when God says, remember Bethel, remember Gilgal, they point out God wants us to obey him, and he is very disappointed in us when we disobey him. And this whole idea that we've got to straighten out our God spell, and then God is going to bless our efforts in reaching the whole world with the good news and the hope of the kingdom, instead of the God spell. Now, I think I covered all that, and that's still not, I'm not saying that's the reason why Dan isn't amongst the bride, but I'd say there's a strong possibility that's part of the reason. Now, I wanted to just throw in a few things here that are general. I want to encourage whoever watches these to always go back and read the commentary. It takes me some time to read it all. Sometimes I do it within a day. Sometimes it takes me a month. But encourage you to at least wait a little bit of time and go back and check the commentary. I put a lot of things that I feel I missed, and scriptures and ideas come to me and so on. So concerning that, in my last episode, I wanted to add something to the idea of the Jubilees. The Jubilees are 50-year segments that God has divided his whole plan into 50-year segments. He has a plan where 6,000 years are allotted to man and Satan working in partnership. This is Satan's world. Satan's allowed to deceive us and interfere as much as God lets him, because God has a perfect purpose, and Satan is part of that perfect purpose. So that 6,000 years is divided into 120 Jubilees. And then, of course, the 1,000 years that follow it is pictured by the Sabbath day. The 6 working days of the week are man and Satan working in partnership, and then the 1,000 years of the millennium is the Sabbath day of rest for the people of God, where there will be no Satan. There will be physical people, but there will be no more Satan for that time period, and he's released. Anyway, for the purpose of what I'm trying to say, remember I pointed out from the book of Jubilees, we know the Exodus happened on the 50th Jubilee. The whole entire 50 years was taken up by the Exodus experience. So, being there's 40 years they were in the desert and they crossed on a Jubilee, there's 10 years before that remains a little more it hasn't been fully revealed yet. And because the Exodus story is a prophecy of how the Great Tribulation unfolds, we need to know what those first 10 years were all about. So anyway, I'll eventually get to part 2 of how the Great Tribulation unfolds. But I want to add a couple things about these Jubilees. So we know that the Exodus happened on the 50th Jubilee. We've got 70 left. And remember, back a few episodes, I feel God showed me that the 70 weeks of Daniel are actually translated properly, the 70 sets of weeks of years. They're talking about Jubilees. So 70 Jubilees are talking about the 70 Jubilees left after the Exodus, until the second Exodus happens, or the Great Tribulation. And then I showed you how that's broken into 7 Jubilees first, until David came. He was the anointed ruler. He came during that 7th Jubilee. From the time he was anointed till the time he died would be about 50 years. And then another 62 would pass until Yeshua would come. And as it says in Daniel, he disappears and vanishes. Well, that's the event of him coming as a thief in the night to take his bride. That happens near the beginning of the tribulation in the first few years. And I've talked about all these things. We are seeing them more clearly as time progresses. And so we need to be examining those first 10 years from the 3 accounts of the Exodus story. One in the book of Moses, the Torah, one in the book of Jubilees, and one in the book of Jasher. Now, I want to point one more thing out, just about at a time. In the book of Jubilees, there's a promise on the 50th, in the 50th chapter. Book of Jubilees is broken into 50 chapters, and the 50th one is quite remarkable. It contains, amongst other things, it contains a promise that if you keep the land Sabbath, you will know when the Jubilee year is. Now, I didn't know about that until I reread it here very recently. I did remember that, but my wife and I were compelled, I'm going to say, by the Spirit of God to keep the land Sabbath. We farmed for the majority of our lives, and we allowed our land to keep its Sabbath several times. And I have a high degree of confidence that I know when the Jubilee year is. And that fulfills that promise in the book of Jubilees in the 50th chapter. Anyway, I've said this before, but the Jubilee, I have very little doubt, or no doubt, let's put it that way. I know I can be wrong, but I have no doubt that the Jubilee was from the Day of Atonement 2017 to the Day of Atonement 2018. That completed the last Jubilee cycle. So now, we are now just completed the first year of the next Jubilee cycle. And this whole 50 years is dedicated to the day of the Lord. But there's different components to it, and we've just talked about how we need to see the spirit of Elijah come, straighten out the crooked paths. I feel that's likely to be happening immediately. And I've been working on that actually now 4 years since I started this YouTube channel. I saw right from the start that I was participating in the time of the restoration of all things, which is the same time as Malachi 4, 1-6, when this spirit of Elijah would come and turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. That's a metaphor for turning us, the children of God, back to the ways of God which are found in the Torah. Okay, I think I covered, well, I'm out of time, so that's all I'm going to cover. So, God bless you. See you soon. This is Rock Our World.